Beneath the blistering Indian sun, the Daya River flowed not with water, but with the crimson stain of 100,000 lives. The air, once thick with the clash of steel and the screams of the dying, had fallen into a chilling, profound silence. This was the field of Kalinga in 261 BCE, the aftermath of a great victory for the Mauryan Empire. It was a landscape of absolute conquest, where the price of unifying a subcontinent was written in the bodies of its people. This was not merely a battle won, it was a kingdom erased. Beyond the slain soldiers, another 150,000 civilians, the old, the young, the artisans and farmers, were rounded up and deported, their homes left to ruin. The victory was total, the strategic objective achieved with brutal efficiency. Yet, in the quiet that followed the slaughter, the very definition of power was about to be challenged by the architect of this devastation. To understand this momentous turn, one must first understand the man. Before he was known as Ashoka the Great, he was Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. He was the grandson of the Mauryan dynasty's founder, and his ambition was forged in the unforgiving crucible of dynastic politics. His path to the throne was not one of peaceful succession, but a bloody consolidation of power, a campaign waged not against foreign enemies, but against his own family. Ancient texts, though perhaps embellished, tell a chilling story of his ascent. Legend claims he killed 99 of his own brothers to eliminate any rival claim to the imperial capital of Pataliputra. This was not a ruler given to philosophical reflection or moral doubt. He was a pragmatist of the highest order, a military strategist who understood that the foundation of an empire rested on unwavering strength and the absolute removal of any threat. The war against Kalinga was the logical endpoint of this ruthless ambition. On the grand map of India, the Mauryan Empire stretched across nearly the entire subcontinent, a colossal power without equal. Yet one significant territory remained independent, Kalinga, on the eastern coast. Its existence was a flaw in the vision of a perfectly unified state, an unacceptable challenge to Ashoka's total authority. Kalinga's defiance was not just political, it was economic. The kingdom controlled vital sea lanes and ports that opened up lucrative trade routes across the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia. It was a hub of commerce and a source of immense wealth, including prized war elephants. To control Kalinga was to control the economic arteries of the East, securing a flow of riches and resources that would fuel the imperial machine for generations. For an emperor like Chandashoka, the subjugation of Kalinga was a strategic imperative. The campaign was meticulously planned, the outcome all but certain given the overwhelming might of the Mauryan army. The bloody war was a calculated investment, the cost in human lives a known and accepted price for achieving the ultimate goal, a single undisputed sovereign power from the mountains of the Hindu Kush to the southern plains. And yet, standing amidst the ruins of his greatest military achievement, the victor confronted a reality that strategy maps could not capture. The neat lines of conquest dissolved into the horrific tableau of human suffering. The legend, immortalized in his own inscriptions carved into rock and stone across his empire, tells of a conqueror consumed not by pride, but by a profound spiritual crisis. The cost of his ambition was finally laid bare. This moment presents history's great question. What happens when absolute victory feels like undeniable defeat? Was this a genuine wave of human empathy breaking through the armor of a ruthless king, a true moment of remorse for the suffering he had caused? Or was it the calculated pivot of a master politician, realizing that an empire built on fear and violence could only be sustained by more fear and violence? From this crisis of conscience, a radical transformation began. Ashoka turned away from the warrior's path and embraced the teachings of Buddhism, a philosophy that had been growing quietly within his own lands. He found a new framework for power, one not based on military conquest, but on moral and ethical conduct. It was a pivot so profound it would redirect the destiny of his empire and influence the world for millennia. The core tenets he adopted were revolutionary for a ruler of his stature. Chief among them was ahimsa, the principle of non-harm to all living beings. Compassion, tolerance, and duty to the welfare of his people became the new pillars of his reign. This was not simply a private conversion. It became the blueprint for a new form of government, an attempt to build a righteous kingdom. The sword was set aside, replaced by a new instrument of imperial policy, Dharma, a complex concept of cosmic law, social responsibility, and moral virtue. Ashoka's ambition did not vanish. It was repurposed. He still sought to conquer, but his new campaigns were to be conquests of righteousness, spreading his philosophy of peace not with armies but with messengers and stone edicts that declared a new vision for what an empire could be. To communicate his profound transformation, Ashoka rejected the transient nature of spoken decrees. Instead, he turned to stone. Across the vast Mauryan landscape, from the rocky outcrops of modern-day Afghanistan to the southern plains of India, a series of imperial messages were carved onto great pillars and rock faces, the rock and pillar edicts. This was an act of political communication without precedent in the ancient world. Imagine a Roman emperor, haunted by the conquest of Gaul, carving his personal regrets and a new philosophy of peace onto monuments throughout his empire. This is the scale of what Ashoka accomplished. On these permanent records, for all to see, he inscribed the principles of his new policy, Dharma. He publicly renounced aggressive warfare, speaking of his deep remorse for the Kalinga slaughter, and committed his reign to a new kind of victory, a victory of righteousness. But what did this turn toward peace actually mean in practice? It was far more than a personal philosophy. It became state policy. Ashoka's administration began to build the architecture of a compassionate empire. Hospitals were constructed for both humans and animals. Wells were dug, and shade trees were planted along major trade routes to ease the burden of travelers. The state, once an engine of military expansion, was now retasked as an instrument of public welfare. To enforce this new moral order, Ashoka created a special class of officials, the Dhamma Mahamatas, or officers of righteousness. Their duty was to travel the empire, not to collect taxes or enforce military law, but to instruct people in the ways of Dhamma, to ensure fair treatment of servants and prisoners, and to manage the state's charitable donations. It was a systematic attempt to replace the rule of the sword with the governance of moral suasion. This shift represented a fundamental redefinition of imperial power. The strength of the Mauryan state would no longer be measured by the territory it conquered, but by the well-being and moral character of its subjects. Ashoka was attempting to pivot an entire civilization away from the pursuit of military glory and toward the cultivation of social harmony, a grand ambition to build an empire bound not by fear, but by a shared ethical code. Yet, a critical question lingers, one that historians have debated for centuries. Can we truly accept this transformation as a pure and simple change of heart? Or was it perhaps a stroke of unparalleled political genius? A skeptic might argue that peace was simply a more effective strategy for controlling a massive, diverse, and potentially rebellious empire. Military subjugation is expensive and requires constant vigilance. An empire as vast as the Mauryan was a complex mosaic of different cultures, languages, and religions, always simmering with the potential for revolt. By promoting a universal ethical code like Dhamma, one that preached respect, tolerance, and nonviolence, Ashoka provided a powerful, unifying ideology. It was a form of soft power that could pacify dissent and consolidate his rule far more cheaply and effectively than an army ever could. This leads us to the central paradox of the penitent emperor. For all his advocacy of nonviolence, Ashoka never disbanded his formidable army. The military machine that had conquered Kalinga remained intact, a clear message that the state's capacity for violence was undiminished. While the emperor preached peace, his power ultimately still rested on the threat of force. Furthermore, his remorse for the Kalinga War never translated into relinquishing the territory he had so brutally conquered. Kalinga remained firmly under Mauryan control. Ashoka expressed regret for the conquest, but he never gave back its spoils. The fruits of his violent past continued to enrich his peaceful present. And while he advocated for compassion and forgiveness, the emperor retained the state's authority to enact the death penalty for serious crimes. He was a ruler who spoke of mercy, but presided over a justice system that still held the power of life and death. This was not the reign of a saint, but the complex and often contradictory rule of a powerful monarch attempting to reconcile a revolutionary ideal with the pragmatic, often brutal realities of maintaining an empire. Ashoka's dilemma echoes across millennia. a timeless question for any great power that achieves dominance through force. The story of a superpower grappling with the moral consequences of its military actions is not confined to the ancient world. It is a recurring pattern in history, a moment of reckoning when the architects of empire must decide what their power is truly for. His strategic pivot from hard power, the raw might of his armies, to soft power, the compelling force of cultural and moral influence, was a political experiment on a scale the world had never seen. This was an attempt to rule not by the sword but by an idea. It is a strategy that modern nations still pursue, using ideology and values as tools of statecraft, hoping to win the hearts and minds of those they wish to lead. Yet, a profound and troubling question hangs over this legacy. Within 50 years of Ashoka's death, the mighty Mauryan Empire, which had once stretched across nearly the entire subcontinent, began to break apart. The dynasty he had secured with the blood of Kalinga did not long survive his turn toward peace. Did his very policies of non-aggression weaken the empire's military fiber, leaving it vulnerable to internal rebellion and external threats? Did the massive state spending on public works, on missionaries, and on the propagation of Dharma bankrupt the state treasury? The historical record suggests a connection, presenting the ultimate paradox, that an emperor's profound moral awakening may have sowed the seeds of his dynasty's destruction. So, can a bloody war really turn a king toward peace? The life of Ashoka provides a complex and powerful answer. The slaughter at Kalinga did not extinguish his ambition. It transformed it. He remained a conqueror to his core, but the territory he sought to win was no longer of this earth. The war forced him to redefine the very meaning of victory. He turned his immense will from military conquest to a new, more enduring campaign. This was the Dhamma Vijaya, or the conquest by righteousness. He sought to conquer not with soldiers, but with morality, not with fear, but with piety. This, he believed, was a victory that mattered for the next world. Ashoka's ultimate ambition was to win a legacy not of land, but of spirit. His story is therefore not about a conqueror who gave up his power, but about one who, after seeing the true, horrifying cost of worldly dominion, chose to pursue a far greater and more lasting form of greatness. The final, enduring image of Ashoka is not of a conqueror, but of a builder. His legacy was not etched into the memories of defeated peoples, but carved into the very stone of the subcontinent. Stupas, monasteries, and pillars, inscribed with his moral vision, rose across the land, physical manifestations of an empire governed by conscience. This was a radical act of statecraft, to replace the sword with the written word, and the fear of armies with the appeal to a higher moral law. Yet this grand experiment in peaceful governance carried within it the seeds of its own decay. An empire built on military might cannot simply set aside its sword without consequence. The Mauryan state under Ashoka's successors found itself unable to muster the ruthless force required to hold its vast and disparate territories together. The very peace Ashoka had cultivated left the empire vulnerable to internal dissent and external threats that were not bound by the same philosophy of nonviolence. Herein lies a fundamental paradox of power. The tools required to build an empire are often the opposite of those needed to sustain a just and peaceful society. A conqueror must be relentless, strategic, and often brutal. A benevolent ruler must be compassionate, just, and restrained. For one man to embody both is a near impossibility, and for an entire system of governance to transition from one to the other risks systemic collapse. The state, as a mechanism of control, is slow to unlearn its own violence. This tension is not unique to Ashoka. Consider the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king who spent most of his reign on the brutal frontiers of the empire, fighting desperate wars against Germanic tribes. He wrote his Meditations, a masterpiece of Stoic philosophy, from a military tent, surrounded by the machinery of war. Unlike Ashoka, he never renounced violence. He saw it as a grim, necessary duty to protect the civilization he cherished. The contrast reveals two different answers to the same agonizing question. For Aurelius, peace was a state to be defended, even through bloody conflict. His power was a burden, and war was its most terrible obligation. For Ashoka, the bloody conflict itself was the ultimate moral poison. He concluded that no strategic gain, no imperial glory could justify the suffering he had witnessed at Kalinga. His power, therefore, had to be completely repurposed. This divergence shows that the path a ruler chooses is not merely a matter of strategy, but a reflection of a deeply personal reckoning. Imagine the silence in the emperor's chambers after the reports from the battlefield have been read. It is in that quiet space, away from the generals and ministers, that the true nature of power is weighed. Is it a tool for expansion, a shield for defense, or a platform for a moral ideal? The answer shapes not just the fate of nations, but the soul of the ruler. The Mauryan Empire did eventually break apart, less than 50 years after Ashoka's death. His successors lacked his conviction and his authority. Regional governors asserted their independence, and foreign invaders began to chip away at the frontiers. The Great Peace, the Dhamma Vijaya, proved to be a fragile creation, too reliant on the force of one man's transformed will. The machinery of the state, once Ashoka was gone, reverted to its more primal instincts of ambition and conflict. But the failure of the political structure does not signify the failure of the idea. Ashoka's message, carried by missionaries, traveled far beyond the borders of his crumbling empire. It moved east along the Silk Road into China and south by sea to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. The principles of nonviolence and compassionate rule became foundational to Buddhist kingship for over 1,000 years, shaping societies in ways Ashoka himself could never have foreseen. His story forces us to ask a difficult question about history itself. How do we measure the success of a leader? Is it by the longevity of their dynasty, the size of their treasury, or the stability of their borders? Or is it measured by the endurance of their ideals? The Mauryan Empire is a distant memory, a subject for historians and archaeologists, but the moral dilemma Ashoka faced remains intensely relevant. Ultimately, the king who turned toward peace discovered a different kind of power. It was not the power to command armies or conquer territories, but the power to inspire a new way of thinking about human society. His bloody war in Kalinga did not just change him. It created a legacy that argued against the very nature of imperial ambition itself. And that argument, carved in stone and carried in the hearts of millions, has outlasted the empire it was meant to govern.